Good morning, everyone. I call this meeting of the Public Accounts Committee meeting to order. We'll begin with introductions, starting with Mr. Goff.
Stephen Goff, filling in for Brenda McGuire.
MLA Suzanne Lonis-Croft, Lunenburg.
Good morning. I'm Terry Farrell, the MLA for Cumberland North.
Yoakum Strong, Halifax, Chebucto.
Ian Rankin, Timberley Prospect.
Good morning. My name is Tim Houston. I'm the MLA for Pictou East.
Good morning. Sterling Bellevue, the MLA for Queens Shelburne.
I'm Alan McMaster, MLA for Inverness, and your chair, and also like our guests to introduce themselves, starting with Mr. LaFlèche.
Paul LaFlèche, I'm the Deputy Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. Had to check that we didn't change.
Alan Grant, Executive Director of Policy for Transportation.
I'm Diane Surratt, and I'm the Executive Director of Finance for Transportation and Internal Services.
Bruce Fitzner, I'm Chief Engineer for Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
And I'm Martha Stevens. I'm the Acting CEO for Tourism Nova Scotia.
Thank you. So we have Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal, and Tourism Nova Scotia to discuss the Yarmouth Ferry. Mr. LaFlèche or Ms. Stevens, who would like to give opening remarks?
I'm giving opening remarks.
Mr.
We promised Ms. Stevens, as this is her first appearance and she's acting, that the members opposite would take it easy on her.
Okay.
And to that extent, we have arranged for the replacement of Brendan with Stephen Goff.
Okay. Please proceed, Mr. LaFlèche.
Brendan was the toughest guy last week at the Economic Committee in questioning. Okay, so good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Yarmouth Ferry with you. I brought with me today the people who have just introduced themselves, and they have been working very hard on this file in an effort to ensure that there's a long-term stable ferry service between Yarmouth and New England, a commitment of the government. They have been, we believe that we've achieved what we set out to, and you may recall that I was at the Economic Committee last September and outlined a certain number of concepts which we would follow in the upcoming request for service. We believe we've followed those concepts. We've really developed a deal with Bay Ferries with respects the overall instructions that we received from the government, and respects really what the people of Nova Scotia and Southwest Nova in particular are expecting in terms of a ferry service. Government believes very much in this service. I said that last year, and we believe it's part of the gateway to the province of Nova Scotia. We have many gateways. We have the Halifax Airport as a gateway. We have the gateway through Marine Atlantic and the Sydney Airport in Cape Breton. We have the gateway through Amherst that Mr. Fitzner over here so proudly maintains with a modest toll operation. And we have a gateway, in fact, through Digby, through the year-round ferry service offered by Bay Ferries. We also have a gateway through Pictou County, where Mr. Houston comes from, also maintained by Bay Ferries to PEI. So we have a number of gateways, and the view of the government is that this is really the extreme southwest Yarmouth area, Shelburne, Clare's gateway out of the province, the Yarmouth Ferry to New England, a traditional ferry, a traditional service, and maintaining a traditional relationship that has existed for hundreds of years. Last Thursday, we signed a 10-year agreement with Bay Ferries to provide for this ferry service, and we did announce last year that we would have a long-term stable agreement. That was our objective, and whoever bid on the agreement would be eligible to have it up to a 10-year deal. Of course, 10 years is a long, long time, and things will change over 10 years, but we wanted a partner who had the financial stability and the expertise to commit to that type of situation. The ferry that they have managed to sign on, so to speak, and my staff will go into some details on that, is a fast ferry. It's a 5.5-hour crossing. We believe that that offers significant benefit. We've had experience with both the fast and the slow crossing. In recent years, and in many years back on that service to either Portland or Bar Harbor. So the fast ferry is what we came and settled on as the best service to try at this time. We believe that Bay Ferries represents a very good operator. They've operated a service in this area before. They've operated the Digby service at this time on behalf of the federal government, and the province, as well as the province of New Brunswick, is proud to commit some support to that service so that commercial trucking can get to the centre of Canada and to the New England markets. And they also operate as I mentioned earlier, the PEI service. They're an experienced operator that have been around a long time. They've been through ups and downs, and they've always been very truthful in terms to the public and to the government in terms of past issues on ferry services. They know what they're taking on in terms of the boat and in terms of operating a ferry. They understand the risks and they're prepared to take the risks. I'll mention as a point of interest that in the 3 rounds of solicitation that have happened for ferries, 3 rounds dating back some 4 years, there's only been one actual ferry operator that's ever submitted, and that was in this last round, Bay Ferries. All other operators were people who may have had some experience on a boat. They may have known port from starboard, and I'll just show in case people don't know the difference. I've got some props here, port, starboard. Alan is in fact wearing these today in case you need some modeling of them later. They are available, Alan, right, for purchase. So Bay Ferries in fact knows port for starboard, and I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek, but at times I worried that the last operator had trouble on that front. Bay Ferries is an experienced operator, and that's what we wanted to see here. The fact that we had no other experienced operators bid on the service in the 3 rounds of solicitation sort of gives you an indication of how much interest there was in running this operation service under the previous conditions that were put out. The Yarmouth Ferry service is not without its challenges. I came here to the Economic Committee of the Legislature last September and said that probably we would be looking at a low double-digit subsidy for the long term for this ferry service. And I know that not a lot of people heard me because the charismatic Mr. Amundsen from Novastar was talking at the same time, and he sort of took the wind out of the sails of us dull bureaucrats. But we did say that. You can check the record. And in fact, some reporters who are now up in the gallery were astute enough to in fact report that, and I congratulate them. So we did say that. All transportation ferries in Canada require a subsidy. Some are subsidized lightly. Most are subsidized extremely heavily, including the Marine Atlantic ones, and including many in Newfoundland and on the BC coast. This type of ocean-going ferry is usually the benefit of a very large subsidy. So last September, we didn't want to hide from it. We wanted to tell people we were not looking for an operator who was going to tell us they were going to have some extreme numbers of passengers, make a profit, and it was all going to be great, because we knew that was not the story on these ferries. It might have been the story in a different era, a long time ago, when the Scotia Prince ran, but it has not been the story in a long time. So the type of subsidy we looked at and we've signed for here is very consistent with what we told you last fall. We hope it would be less. We would all hope that ferries make profits. Mr. Fitzner runs a number of ferries. None of them make a profit. And when he tried to move from, I think, 90 to 85% subsidy last year, there was a big uproar in the many communities that have that ferry service. So that gives you an indication of how highly subsidized ferries are around the world. It's not apologizing. It's just stating a fact. To go out and tell you that this ferry is going to make money is setting false expectations. Yarmouth and the southwest of Nova Scotia deserve the same type of transportation features that other areas of the province have that I mentioned. They're all subsidized. Whether you like it or not, the airport is subsidized, All the other ferries are subsidized, and even Bruce Fitzner's highway is subsidized. So every way you get out of this province is subsidized, and Yarmouth at one time, thanks to Mr. Houston's government, had an air line which was for 2 years, very highly subsidized. Nothing new here. While there is a large government investment up front in the ferry, it's not as large as we spent or the previous government contracted to spend on the Nova Star. The province, because it's a service, an operation, assumes the majority of the financial risks, although Bay Ferries as an operator is assuming a large amount of other risks, which some of my staff will get into if you want to ask those questions. They have a reputation to maintain. They're a well-known provider. Back in February, I had the opportunity to go to a deputy minister's meeting, and during the dinner, I walked into the wrong room in the hotel, and lo and behold, I was surrounded by 12 ferry operators from across Canada, one of which was Bay Ferries, and they told me all about the woes of their life. And shortly thereafter, after I left, they got to tell the federal minister the same thing as he walked into the room. And you saw the result in the budget. There was a concession on the importation of ferries that resulted from, I think, that appearance by the federal minister and other representations. Ferry operators across Canada are a group that take on considerable risk, even though it's not financial risk, and we should respect that. We've set what we believe are realistic targets for this ferry. We knew the subsidy would be double-digit initially. We knew there would be some startup costs, and we knew that the passenger counts had to be set realistically. So again, when I appeared last September, and I know only some of the media heard me and some of the other people in the audience, we said 60,000. We didn't say 120. We didn't say 150. We had people who actually bid on other numbers, even though we told them they had to bid on 60. And those bids were, of course, disqualified. We went back to them before we disqualified them and insisted, can you bid on 60? And they said, we don't believe in 60, we have a big number. We weren't interested in that. At this time, we'd like to achieve 60 in the next couple of years. If we achieve a much larger number, that's fabulous. There are other benefits to this run, which will be described by the staff in terms of benefits to Southwest Nova, in terms to the Yarmouth area in itself, which will compensate for a low number. But we hope we get a very high number. But we haven't set the target or any of the budgeting based on any of the numbers you've heard in the past, because we haven't seen evidence of those numbers after 2 years of Nova Star. When we see evidence of such numbers, we will adjust the financial targets to reflect that increased income. We have a number of strategies to maintain and mitigate financial risks. We have a large number of built-in contingencies, and I'll allow my staff to explain that under questioning. The Auditor General has looked, and the internal auditor, sorry, Mr. Pickup, you should be sitting here where the Premier's desk is. Big guys in big chairs. So the internal auditor, Ted Doan, has in fact looked at the previous agreement and made several suggestions on the monitoring of the agreement and how we should ensure that things don't get out of hand like they might have, some people say, under Nova Star. So we've built that into our agreements, and we've worked hard with our internal auditor, Ted Doan, and his team to ensure that this time we have better protection for the taxpayer. Our goal here is to maximize benefits for Nova Scotians. Last year, again, when I appeared, people asked about the subsidy. What would it be? I said, the subsidy really depends on the economic benefit. If it costs a little more, but we receive a lot more benefit in terms of tourists and dollar spending in Southwest Nova, if my good buddy Sterling Bellevaux there, if his restaurants and hotels in Queens and Shelburne County are more full and those in Yarmouth are more full, that's a great benefit, and we can probably endure a little higher subsidy. So we'd like to see that. So a lot of this is flexible. What is the economic benefit we are going to get as Nova Scotians? We wanted to maximize that. This agreement has some provisions that are very different than the previous agreement with Nova Star that allows us to build a higher level of economic benefit into Southwest Nova and indeed into the entire province. And you've seen that from some of the comments. So with that, I know I've taken up a lot of time here. I usually don't take up a lot of time, and last week at the Economic Committee on Cape Breton Rail, I did take up a lot of time. But I do want to mention that last night I saw that my poor Director of Policy and Legislation was accused of not giving out the ferry regs for Cape Breton Rail. I do have them here. Apparently we couldn't get them out of the Queen's printer on time, but I've got a copy, so if anybody needs them, we do have them. We do have the regs for Cape Breton Rail ready to go, as we promised last week. And I was rather beat up in the media last night over not having these apparently at the schedule of the filing deadline for certain media outlets. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. LaFleche. We'll begin with Mr. Houston for 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the open comments. I have utmost respect for the Deputy and his department, but I would like to remind him that I have 20 minutes of questionings this time, and Nova Scotians have a lot of concerns, and I have a lot of questions about this. So I will try to be very concise in my questions, and I would just ask that you equally try to be concise in the responses where possible. I want to start off with, what month did the department decide to deal exclusively with Bay Ferries? What was the month?
Well, I will allow the people who actually participated in that process to answer those questions, and maybe I should start by saying there has been some insinuation that the minister and myself actually participated in the selection. We did not. It was done to a mirror of a standard procurement process, even though it was a request for services and not an RFP. So I believe that was headed by Mr. Fitzner, and I will let him and Mr. Grant and Mr. Surratt and Mr. Stevens answer those questions.
Mr. Fitzner?
I believe it was October.
October, okay. And in their initial proposal, did they identify a boat that they would use for the route?
They didn't name a specific boat. They did describe the type of vessel that they were looking for.
Okay, and was it a catamaran?
No, not at that time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they didn't identify a specific vessel, but there was an undertaking that they would, and I believe the media reported that they were going to have a vessel identified by mid-December. Is that accurate to your recollection?
I don't recall what the timing was to have the boat identified.
Okay, but it was before March. Would it be fair to say that?
Yes, I think what the way the language of the RFS was that we would need to strike an agreement within 45 days after they had procured a boat, right?
Okay, but was there anything at the time when the department was looking at all the proposals, and some were ferry operators and some were not, we've heard this morning. Yeah. Some were people who were interested to get into business, and presumably some of them had vessels identified.
Yes.
So some of the people who responded had a vessel identified, and they said, we will use this vessel on this route. Is that?
That was their proposal.
Okay, but the department decided to go with exclusively with Bay Ferries under the understanding that they would secure a vessel at some point.
Right, and the other ones, even though they identified a vessel, would still have had to secure it.
Okay, but the vessel that was identified, when was that ultimately signed up, that they actually now could say they had a vessel to use on the route?
Just last week was.
Okay, so just last week. So sometime between October and March, there was some discussion and some agreement that there would be a vessel, but nobody knew what it was. Did they propose other vessels between October and March?
There were some other vessels that they were considering, and they sort of kept us briefed as they went along. At one point, they came to talk about the catamaran, and whether the province would consider that type of service again. And we basically said, you know, if you feel that's the best boat for the run, then you go ahead and pursue that.
Okay, because presumably at that time it's getting into March. It's this boat or nothing. I'm just trying to understand the mindset of the way that the negotiations were happening. It must have been some pretty stressful times as November passes, no boat, December passes, no boat, January passes, no boat, February passes, no boat, March, we have a boat, better get a deal done, right? There must have been some pressure to...
Well, certainly. I mean, the clock is ticking from the end of last season to this season, and everybody's anxious to get the boat announced. Just because there was no announcement made didn't mean that we weren't aware of, you know, negotiations that were ongoing at the time. And took some time to complete.
Was there any line in the sand that the department put down that said if there's no boat by this date, there's no service this year?
No, we didn't.
Okay, so it was always whenever we're in there with Bay Ferries from October, and we're committed to this, and whatever boat you come up with, we're gonna make it work. Is that kind of the mindset?
No, it was more they were continuing to work on the same vessel. And it was just taking some time working with the U.S. Navy. It's a lot of bureaucracy in that thing, and a lot of people that have to approve that, you know, including in the Pentagon. It's a bit of a different arrangement and commercial use of a Navy boat, so there's not too many of these, so there was a lot of discussion within the Navy to determine what the terms could be.
Okay, were financial penalties as time was passing ever contemplated? Like, if you don't have a boat by this time, this is the penalty.
Well, we really wouldn't have signed a contract with them until we had a boat, right?
But you weren't negotiating with. There was no other games in town. They contracted to the extent there was a contract from October. The department was committed to the extent that there was a contract.
Yeah.
It would be Bay Ferries. That's kind of the environment we're working in, right?
They were the selected one, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. LaFlèche?
Yes. Okay, so I just want to provide some background. I said the minister and I weren't involved in the selection process, but once Bay Ferries was announced and selected, I don't remember the exact date, but we'll get it for you. I was involved in ongoing discussions about the boat. So.
You, Mr. Chair, I'm not there yet, but I'm getting there, and I guess maybe if there's some desire to go there, I would like to talk about that, because clearly Bay Ferries is sitting at the table negotiating for Bay Ferries. That's what businesses do. They negotiate for the benefit of their company. They'd be, wouldn't be a very good business operator if you weren't negotiating for the benefit of your company. So Bay Ferries was negotiating for Bay Ferries. Who was negotiating for the taxpayer? Who was at that table on behalf of the taxpayer? Was it the minister and yourself? Was it the deputy?
No, the minister wasn't at the table, and I was not at the table. What I was trying to say is I was informed of the ongoing situation with negotiations in the boat. So the people basically you see right here, less Miss Stevens, were at the table, and they were in the negotiating team along probably with some legal advice. Lawyers. So we knew basically what the scenario was. We looked at the other people who had submitted proposals and what their proposals for boats were.
It's just if I can try to, time is short, and I do want to kind of get through what I have. I'm interested in the fact that there was an agreement to go exclusively with Bay Ferries, and I'm interested in kind of the ramifications of that, if you will. So how that happened, that they chose to go with Bay Ferries, we can revisit that at some point. But for right now, was there anyone from the Department of Business at the table negotiating with Bay Ferries? Because let's not forget that the province was supposed to be negotiating with Bay Ferries. So at that point, we're trying to get maximum taxpayer benefit. Was anyone from the Department of Business in those negotiations?
Well, the Department of Business includes the tourism agency, and although they didn't sit in on every meeting, they were certainly our close partners in this process and understood every move we were making. So the answer would be yes. But I want to get to the boat. We didn't sit around since November and say, gee, Bay Ferries, do you have a boat? We actually did searches. We checked out what boats were out there. We had extensive conversations with Mr. McDonald about boats worldwide. We looked at all the other people who submitted bids and looked at what boats they said they had. and Mr. Grant, in fact, did a lot of searches on the international registries to check out all these so-called boats. People wrote in letters telling us they had boats.
Yeah, no, I agree.
You know, et cetera, et cetera. So we did a lot of work on boats.
Okay, no, and I think that actually, I understand that with all that work, the pressure to sign a deal and go with what was put in front of you probably got magnified, and I think that's true. That point is bearing out true, I would say, from all that pressure that must have been there. So in terms of the pressure to get a deal done as time passes and boats are harder to identify, the government wanted a deal. They were going to get one, right? So in that environment, let's look at the deal that got, because this is what I think is of most interest to taxpayers, and you referred to taxpayer benefit and stuff. Under the agreement that was signed with Bay Ferry, I presume the agreement is signed by now by all parties?
Yes, it
so
is.
under the signed agreement, thank you, is it possible for Bay Ferries to lose money on this route?
That's kind of a trick. It's kind of a trick question. Is it possible for them to lose money? Yes.
On this route?
They could have a catastrophe. Something could go very wrong, which exceeds their insurance amounts. So it's always theoretically possible.
Okay.
It's like the asteroid hitting the Earth, Tim. You know.
Okay.
Or, sorry, Mr. MLA. What,
they could have a casualty on board.
Mr. Fitzner?
Yeah, they have lots of risk.
For the record, Mr. Fitzner, you were making a comment?
Sorry. No, I just said that if they had a casualty on board or the safety of a passenger wasn't secured, that they could be sued for that, so they would have that risk.
In terms of the day-to-day operations of the ferry, is it possible for them to lose money on this route? Because my understanding is 100% of any cash deficiency is paid by the taxpayers.
That's correct.
I would believe that to mean that it's not possible for the operation of this route to result in Bay Ferries to lose money.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, so Bay Ferries, it won't be a money-losing route for Bay Ferries. That won't be the case. The contract has made sure that it won't lose money, and in fact, I think there's probably a guaranteed profit element built into this contract for Bay Ferries on an annual basis. Would that be fair to say that they're guaranteed to make a profit?
They get a management fee for running the service, yeah.
Right, and
Ms. Surratt? Ms. Surratt? Sorry, just wait until your mic comes on there. You're good to go.
Yeah, just to add to the management fee, we don't pay salaries of the executives of Bay Ferries. In lieu of that, they get a management fee.
Right, and then they determine how they disperse it to their management as a company revenue. But is there any circumstance where the annual management fee to Bay Ferries could be clawed back? Is there any circumstance where they could get less than what they've
Mr. Fitzner?
There's a two-stage sort of management fee. The first stage is base fee, and then there's a secondary fee based on performance targets, which are reducing the overall subsidy amounts. So if they reduce the overall subsidy amounts, they can earn a larger management fee.
Right. So would you be willing to make those base management fee numbers? Could you share those with the committee?
We conferred with the FOIPOP coordinator, and under protection of privacy, that we were advised that we shouldn't put those out, that they were confidential proprietary information that may affect the competitiveness of the operator where they bid on other things.
I respect that opinion, and I'll do a bit of research on that. But I mean, on a 10-year contract, did somebody make the position that it's a competitive disadvantage to Bay Ferries if people know what the management fee is in year 4, 5, and 6? Like, that's all going to be public by the time this contract goes out. So I can't really understand why it shouldn't be public now. But if the answer is no today, maybe we can revisit that, Mr. Chair, and see if we can get that under a confidential basis. But I would ask Mr. Fitzner just on that, is that base management fee, is that set for 10 years? Do you know the number for the entire 10 years?
Yeah, it's a set amount for the 10 years.
So the base runs out for 10 years, okay, and
Yes.
that's known, that's not.
Mr. Houston, Mr. LaFleche wished to make a comment. Would you wish to hear what he has to?
History to the management fee issue. In fact, the Honourable Graham Steele has published some very good material in the last week on why you can't have it now, and he's also published some opinions on why I could overrule this situation in the future, provided I follow a process, which will take some time. So we are in discussions with Bay Ferries because we do have to go through a process. It's third-party privilege, and we may be able to put that out. We may not.
Okay,
but there is a process which Mr. Steele has outlined, and he's quite accurate in what he's outlined. So
okay, thank you. Maybe we'll call Mr. Steele before the committee someday if we can. But right now, I'm more interested in what the
it's
department.
It's always been interesting when he's appeared.
Right now, more what the department is willing to disclose today is my main interest today. So, in terms of the profit element of the management fee, do I understand it correctly that if Bay Ferries says this route is going to lose $1 million, and then it only loses 750, they earn a profit on that, what you would call savings? Some people.
Mr. Fitzner?
Yeah, they would get a percentage of the savings.
Yeah, okay, and that's a contracted amount that's there over the term of the contract.
Yeah.
Now, is there any cap on how much it could cost taxpayers in terms of the subsidy that's paid over the life of the 10-year contract? Is there any point in the contract where it says, gee, we've already paid $100 million, $200 million in this contract, we just can't pay anymore? Is there a cap built into this contract?
So the way the thing works is that we didn't feel it was realistic to try to budget out 10 years because there's so many variables and changes that could happen over 10 years. So we started with a 2-year subsidy amount and budget, and in subsequent years we need to sit down and they will have to submit a budget to us that we will closely scrutinize, and we'll go through the items. And so you know, if we feel that something's excessive, the amount's excessive, we'll challenge it. If we can't resolve it between the two parties, then the agreement allows for it to go to like business commercial arbitration, and an arbitrator will decide whether what they're looking for is reasonable. Now,
so this has
controlled
been
in that manner.
Okay, I appreciate that, because it's been certainly a curiosity of mine. We have a 10-year contract. We have nobody who's even willing to take a stab at how much it'll cost past year 3. We have a boat for a maximum of 4 years. 2 years and then 2 one-year options. So we have a short-term information that we've decided to leverage into a long-term contract, a 10-year contract. And I know the deputy refers to this as being stable, but it's not clear to me what part of that equation is stable, other than that it's 10 years and it's going to cost taxpayers whatever it costs them, with no cap, with no knowledge, with no guess as to what that might be. And why the 10-year contract in that circumstance?
Mr. LaFleche?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to address the issue of, cap. That we pay the deficiency right now that we've, or the subsidy that we've outlined last week is based on 60,000 passengers. So the theoretical maximum for the first 2 years would be if we had no passengers. And if you do that calculation, I'll let you, you're an accountant, do it and come back. Mr. Pickup is thinking about it right now in his head. And you'll find out that that calculation roughly equals the amount we spent on Novastar. So we're already, if we get 0 passengers, not 60,000, we still wouldn't have beat the Novastar record. So that, and if you want to add that up over 10 years, got a little calculator here, you can figure out what it is. So I mean, it's a simple calculation to do that. What we basically said is we sort of estimate 60,000 passengers. We've calculated the subsidy based on that. We feel it's very conservative. Your colleague Alfie really liked that term last week when I kept saying it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. If it's a simple calculation, please share with this committee that calculation for 10 years, because somebody signing a 10-year contract, I would say has an obligation to the taxpayers to have an understanding as to what that might be. Has that calculation been done, and will you share it with this committee? Yeah, and I would actually expect 3 calculations. So one for best case, one for base case, and one for a downside case. Now I've heard the deputy, I guess, say that the 60,000 is a base case, maybe a downside case. I don't know. But is the calculation done for 10 years for any of those scenarios? Mr. Fitzner?
Basically, again, we didn't feel it was realistic to come up with numbers. The further you go out, the more volatility there will be in the numbers. So you could post a number out there. Might be misleading to do that and have people think it's going to be something. So as we get close to the end of the 2-year agreement, and even after each year we'll reevaluate, those budgets will be made public again. So, but I don't understand
in that environment how you can sign a 10-year contract when you're saying today that it wouldn't even make sense to try and estimate what it might cost. Was there any number, and I have seconds left, I guess, but maybe we can get a quick answer, yes or no, was there any number where somebody in the department said, this will be too expensive? Or was this happening in any way? Mr. Fitzner?
I don't think that we know.
There was no. Mr.
Yeah, we knew that it was basically.
Then why didn't we build that into the contract if that was too expensive?
We did.
Why
That's the theoretical maximum. If you look at the calculation, you do it, you'll find the worst we can do is the performance of Novastar if no passenger ever gets on the boat.
Why was the department unwilling to put a cap in then, if you're so clear in your mind that you have?
Well, that is the cap.
Order. Time has expired. We'll move to the NDP caucus. Mr. Belleville.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Flesch, I was making notes on your introduction, and one of the terms that you used, you referred to several other ferry as gateways. And my first question is, you referred to Pigtou, Digby, some other ferries, departures and arrivals across the Nova Scotia Atlantic provinces, and you referred to these as gateways. My question to you and your delegation is, the Portland U.S. ferry, the new CAT, leaves Yarmouth, goes to Portland. Would you agree that that's an international gateway?
Mr. LaFleche?
Well, by definition it is, because you have customs.
Okay, thank you. That leads me to the question where I want to go, is because one of the interesting points in the last several years has, in this particular round of the discussions regarding the ferry system between Portland, United States, and Yarmouth, was the commercial traffic. And I noticed with great disappointment that they didn't meet the criteria and wasn't included in this particular option. So some of my questions are going to be related to how that decision was determined. And if I can just quickly give you some stats, over 60% of Canada's landed fish exports are landed west of Halifax in Nova Scotia. Over 60% of Canada's landed export value, fish value. And I want to suggest that the lobster landings in the last 2 years has been, again, historical landings. Now, that product has to go to market. 80% of the exports of the lobster industry go directly to the United States. So I would conclude that that's why the commercial trucking industry is so interested in having a ferry system that can accommodate their service. Now, with that as a backdrop, I want to get into, was that taken into consideration since last October into this March of the demand of increased fish products landing and the pressure that the truckers wanted to have some commercial space on a vessel like this?
Well, I'm proud to answer that question, and I know the Premier addressed it to some extent yesterday, in fact, the member opposite should be given some of the credit, along with Minister Colwell and the workers in the industry, for working very hard over the last 5 years to get out of a very poor situation with lobster in terms of the price. We've got the price back up. We've got the dollar going our way. We've got historically high demand. In fact, lobster has passed tires as our fish has passed tires, including lobster, but the majority of it is lobster at this point, as our top export. That's all good news. And yes, we worked very hard with the federal government, and I've got to give them credit to ensure that we got a new ferry for Digby, and that ferry is the commercial ferry. If you look at any of the reports going back for a long time, that is the ferry that the industry wanted. If you talk to Jean-Marc Picard from the Atlantic Truckers Association, you will see that that ferry has the arrival times to get into the Boston market, to get into the New York market that they would like, and that is what they asked us for going back several years, that we have a renewal of that service. So various ministers, including yourself, when you were Minister Beliveau and I worked for you, have worked hard to ensure that service was integral, and I'm going to get to Yarmouth in a minute. And I know that because of the incredible success that we've had in the lobster business, the record catches and the rise in price, we've had record exports much beyond what you and I would have believed when we were sitting there, you know, Minister, 4 years ago, and we were sort of in the doldrums. The new ferry that they purchased for Digby does not have the same truck capacity as the older ferry, and around Christmas time there developed a bit of an issue. And you may recall that, and there were some meetings down in Yarmouth and in Southwest Nova to deal with this. At the time, Minister McClellan did phone Dr. Garneau, and I made representations to the federal minister. Dr. Garneau was relatively new in his job as the federal minister at the time, and we worked all together with Bay Ferries to put on some extra runs. We looked at prioritization. We got ourselves through that Christmas hump. I think it worked out rather well, but there was a bit of a panic. Yesterday, myself and Minister McClellan met with Dr. Garneau here in Halifax, and we specifically talked about the issue of having sufficient scheduling and runs in Digby for the lobster season. So we are cognizant of what you said. We're somewhat basking in the success that we've experienced, as again due to your work and that of Minister Colwell in the lobster business. We have you know, the embarrassment of plenty, if you will, right now, so we're working hard to deal with that. It would be nice if during the 4 months of that the Yarmouth ferry operated, they could help out in that, but I will point out, as you very well know, that during those 4 months here in this slide, which I've given to the clerk over here, the lobster season in Southwest Nova is not open. So the live, fresh, not stored in cages, lobster is not even available during the time we have the Yarmouth ferry. There are other fish products with our ferry. Mr. Grant is going to be meeting with the Fish Packers Association tomorrow to have discussions with them. But as of the present time, I won't repeat the news from Yarmouth and U.S. Border Control. It does not appear that at the present time we will be having trucks. This is not a new situation. Except for a small number on the Nova Star, the situation has existed since 2001, and that's why Digby is the chosen route. So we wish it were different, but on the other hand, should we have some incredible tourism success due to Ms. Stevens and the new CEO's marketing acumen, and we get full of tourists, we do not want, you know, one large truck to displace a bus full of tourists, or maybe 10 cars with 30 tourists in them. So we do have a situation there where, in terms of the Nova Star's record, where things were not going that well in terms of passenger counts and cars and buses, we had space. We do not want to predict immediately that we have space, or we will have space, until we see how the season goes. So it's unfortunate. It's not a great situation. We want to work with the industry, and I know that Minister Colwell is very committed to doing that, and we will be doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Oh, and I want to show you something, too, because, in fact, this came from you. This is a little lobster here.
Mr. LaFleche, I can't allow you to have props.
Oh, my God.
I apologize.
Because what I was going to show you, that those Swedish guys have a lobster that looks like this.
Okay.
Okay? So we have the lobster that looks like this. It's a great lobster. I feel bad for Sweden. There's the prop.
Mr. Bellamo.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I can actually do a lecture on using props in this house, so I know but just, I think a point of clarification. You mentioned that the present ferry is not scheduled to go during the present lobster season, and I want to point out that many of the holding facilities in southwest Nova Scotia, in fact across Nova Scotia, are capable and do have lobsters in stock year-round because of their controlled temperature and their holding facilities. So they actually have product year-round going to market. So I think that needs to be recognized. I'm interested again, and I didn't hear in your first answer, was the discussion about commercial traffic. And during the media scrums, it was pointing out that the City of Portland owns a terminal, but they were not prepared to permit commercial truck traffic in their ferry terminal. And I have been to Portland a few times, and I visited the Portland Fish Exchange. So I'm having struggle with the terms of that, and I don't have all the geographical areas, but there is a large fish exchange in Portland. Now, I'm struggling with this, and help me understand why the pillars of that community do not want fish trucks in one part, but yet have a fish exchange in the other. And how aggressive did this committee pursue commercial traffic and getting on a ferry system?
Well, I've been to Portland too recently. I've seen been to the new marine terminal, and I don't know if you've been there, but you can appreciate that situation is very different from the old terminal where the previous ferries landed. I'll let Mr. Grant outline how aggressively we pursued this and how aggressively Mr. McDonald of Bay Ferries has.
Mr. Grant.
Thank you. I want to apologize. I'm feeling a bit under the weather, so I'll try to answer the question as best I can. Bay Ferries has been having discussions with the City of Portland for a while now about the terms of their agreement with the terminal, which includes commercial truck traffic. We've asked recently for some additional information, which unfortunately I didn't get before today's meeting, about developments related to Ocean Gateway in Portland. And if the member has been at the new terminal in Portland, you will appreciate that there's been a lot of development of not only the ferry terminal there, but commercial cruise ship industry in Portland. And so there's the city has been struggling, I guess, with an issue of offloading commercial traffic in an area that is really becoming increasingly more designed to move tourist traffic in and out of the city. So we will get more information about the Ocean Gateway initiative and what the specific concerns of the City of Portland are there. But Bay Ferries in their negotiations were aware of this very early on, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, Mark McDonald went, when he was in Southwest Nova, either the end of last calendar year or early this calendar year, had indicated to the commercial trucking industry that there were restrictions on commercial traffic in and out of Portland for any operator, not just them. And I think he worked aggressively to address some of those concerns at the time. Beyond that, we know that there are concerns with U.S. border security and homeland security in terms of the facilities that they have in Portland to inspect inbound and outbound trucks. And the footprint that the terminal operation now occupies has been reduced a little bit. And so there is an issue with just handling large volumes of commercial traffic there. So we will continue the discussion. As we get more information from Portland, we'd be happy to share that. But at this time, the negotiations are between Bay Ferries and the City of Portland.
Good. Mr. Chair, through you to the delegation, again, the commercial traffic to me has been excluded from this particular service. During the discussions of determining what terminal, what port you were going to enter, there's other terminals. I suggest Boston, Bar Harbor, that may be more friendly to commercial traffic. Was them options looked at?
Mr. LaFleche.
Boston is a much longer run. We did have preliminary thoughts about Boston and talked about it, but it was not part of the request for service. Bar Harbor is a different case. In fact, Bay Ferries and Marine Atlantic both went into Bar Harbor over the years. Before we put out the request for service, I did have a conversation with the Federal Transport Deputy, with the Associate Deputy, and with Paul Griffin, the CEO, President of Marine Atlantic, who are the owners of the Bar Harbor facility. And we did look at Bar Harbor. We assessed the situation there. And if you remember, one of the other things I said last fall is that the wish of the government was no annual discontinuance of service. Bar Harbor is not ready. It's not certified at this point. It's rather derelict. It requires somewhere between 5 and 10 million. Who knows if that's a real figure or it's much more than that of renovations. It's in the process of being disposed of by Marine Atlantic. There are potential buyers. I did inquire whether, you know, we or an operator for us could get involved in that, and they're far down the pike apparently. You can check for yourself. But we were, my impression after sussing it out, and then we asked Bay Ferries to suss it out, was that we're probably 2 or more years away from seeing Bar Harbor in any sort of condition to accept a ferry vessel or cruise vessels. So Bar Harbor as a possibility is never off the table, but it was off the table for the next 2 or more years. So that's why Bar Harbor wasn't looked at. I want to mention that we've received a lot of input from the citizens of Nova Scotia regarding an idea, a concept they have called the Halifax to Boston ferry. We have not been tasked to look at the Halifax to Boston ferry. That has not come under any consideration. We were tasked to look at something called the Yarmouth ferry, and we've been working very hard on that. So I don't know if the members want to get into the Halifax to Boston ferry, but our whole objective, given that Halifax does have an international airport, was to look at the ferry that would service and serve as a gateway for Southwest Nova. But I do appreciate that the citizens of Nova Scotia have come up with this idea, and we have it. And if ever we're around when such a concept is of favor, we will pass on all the material they've sent to us to those who are dealing with that issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the questions I've been eager to get to is I think I can conclude that we all agree that this particular route that we're describing from Portland, from Yarmouth, is an international gateway. And to me, when I describe an international gateway, I assume that there's other partners that should be at that table. And I noticed with great interest, Mr. Chair, that there was $51.9 million from the previous federal budget, just announced a few weeks ago, supporting ferry services in Atlantic Canada. And the member opposite named a number of them, PEI, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and I think we can come up with pretty well all of them. $51.9 million is a considerable amount of money that goes to all the ferries in Atlantic Canada except one. One. And I raised this question since I've been in this House. And it baffles me to know, and we all agree, that we have an international gateway. We have a U.S. federal partner. I think we should be at the table. We have a federal partners all across Atlantic Canada. And we're asking the provincial taxpayers to bear the burden on every penny of subsidy for that Yarmouth ferry. And I'm asking you the question. I seen in the previous election last October, federal MPs in southwest Nova Scotia stand up and determined to go to their cabinet and demand money for that Yarmouth ferry. And we've seen $51.9 million allotted to Atlantic Canada, not one penny going to Yarmouth ferry. Explain to me what discussions went on, what was involved in trying to get some money allotted to that Yarmouth ferry.
Mr. LaFleche.
Yeah, well, Minister, you were the political minister for Southwest Nova when this started, so you can do part of the explaining to yourself.
We got zero.
Later, right? So no, you didn't get zero. Actually, Greg Kerr was the federal MP. I know he's a friend of mine, as you know, and he's a friend of the Premier's. And he did get what he could get out of the federal system at that time. It was rather disappointing for all of us, but what he got was quite a bit of money put into the terminal, the upgrades, the infrastructure. So yesterday when we met with Dr. Garneau, I arrived a bit late because I had a bit of a brake failure on my bike coming down the hill, but I was able to, not rollerblades, the bike. I was able to witness Minister McClellan asking him about the upgrades that we will be required to do to the Yarmouth terminal, again, for this ferry, and whether there would be federal support for that. That conversation has started. We will continue that conversation. That's not a large amount of money, but it would be a federal contribution, similar to the ones they made when you were minister, and the ones they made there were, I think, several million. I can't recall. Maybe it was 2 million, Minister?
Order. I do apologize. We've run out of time. I'll move to the Liberal caucus. Mr. Rankin.
Thanks very much, and I appreciate the opening comments, especially the description of how subsidies work with ferries, and I think that's important. Not everybody in the public even realizes that all ferries are subsidized, and for that matter, basically every mode of transportation in the province is subsidized, including the airports. So when you hear of the backstop or the deficiency guarantee profit was used, I think the taxpayers really want to understand if this is a better deal than the Nova Star, but more importantly, is this the best deal we can ask for today? So having said that, can you describe the distinction between, and you can use numbers that might highlight the difference between the Nova Star deal as it relates to the charter fee agreements and the deal we have today? How does that work?
Okay, well, I'll probably pass that over to Ms. Surratt here, but what I would like to start by saying is that, you know, there's been some some idea out there floating around that we didn't do very good negotiating. We negotiated a lot of things. As you know, we've just finished negotiating with Mr. Ramia, who thinks that, you know, he got done in by us. So we're not necessarily horrible negotiators, but I guess there's an opinion that we are. My predecessor, Simon d'Entremont, negotiated with Nova Star, and you know, in retrospect, that doesn't look like such a great deal now, but at the time, there were different parameters in play in the public. As Mr. Bellevaux knows, he was there, and things have been learned since. And they negotiated what they thought was a very good deal at the time. Didn't turn out that way. We're negotiating here. We negotiated what we thought was what we think is a very good deal. We think we got the best deal we could. I know a lot of people thought that someone should bid on this and lose money. Those bidders simply in 3 rounds weren't out there. We didn't see anybody who came to us and said, geez, can we run your ferry and lose money? That just is not a concept that's out there in the private sector. Government subsidized ferries, that's the way it is. So we did the best we could. You know, I got beat up this morning. Kids beat me up when I woke up, so I'm feeling very beat up at this point in time. Scott Bryson sent me an email, and his kids didn't beat him up, apparently. They waved him goodbye as he flew to Ottawa. So, and here I had to come down to public accounts getting beat up by my own kids. But I think...
Okay. So that's an important point, what you're saying, though. If you would have pressed for more and said that you wouldn't guarantee the level that you did, that threshold, would they have walked away, and would we have no ferry today?
We only have one. We only had one real operator.
One option.
Bid in 3 rounds, and it's because we finally said last September, this is going to be a subsidized ferry service like every other. We got rid of that mysterious magic thing where we're going to make oodles of money and people are going to bid and they're going to submit things like we're going to get 250,000 passengers, blah, 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 and we're going to run casinos, etc. All of that stuff is not of this era. It's of another era. It doesn't work today. We got rid of all that and said we're going to run this like every other ferry because Yarmouth deserves what everybody else has in Nova Scotia and everybody else has in Canada. So that's what we did, and I'll allow Miss... I got a bigger calculator than you. We'll allow Miss Surratt to explain how we did the negotiations. Ms. Surratt.
Yeah, so just you'd asked what the comparison between the previous operator and the operator that we have now. So in terms of the money that went out the door for the last 2 seasons, the original agreement was $21 million over 7 years, and we ended up giving $28.5 million in the first season, and then there was another commitment for $13 million. So we managed the previous operator to the $13 million, but I think it's important to understand that that only brought us to October. So if we had continued on with Nova Star, we would have had to provide more funding, and we would probably be looking at the second season at around $22 to $25 million. So if you're comparing Nova Star to Bay Ferries, in terms of the charter is about $4.5 million. With the exchange rate, it's $3.2 million US a year. If we paid the charter for Nova Star, we would be just under $11 million this year, based on the 7-year contract that we had for the charter agreement. Also important, I think, to note is that by 2020, because the way that the charter went was, it was low, if you want to consider that low, in the first years, and it was rising in the out years. So by 2020, the charter would have been over $16 million a year. For the charter that we have with the U.S., it's $4.5 million a year, and if we extend the next 2 years, so if we go to 4, we're still at $4.5 million a year. So considerably lower than what the Nova Star was.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Stroink.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I guess I kind of want to touch on, first let me express I'm disappointed to see that the member from Argyle-Barrington's not here, because I'd love to hear what his views are on this topic. As you know, he's quoted as saying, can Southwest Nova be assured that the ferry service will continue? If it doesn't, I don't know if I can go back to my community and put up with the negativity that we did during the first 4 years that we didn't have the service. And then you have the member from Mr. Houston saying this is a stupid deal, maybe an incompetent, desperate government. So I guess, you know, when you hear that kind of stuff, you know, within leaders of this province, within the same party, you wonder, you know, do you really care about the Southwest Nova, or Southwest area of Nova Scotia? And the social economic drives of this contract is so fundamentally important when lighthouses, you know, lost 20% of revenue from the cut of the ferry. Businesses lost 20% of business, and and a lot of businesses closed because of the cut of the ferry. So I guess when you hear that kind of stuff, you want to be assured that the Bay Ferries has some skin in the game. So I guess what kind of risk are they taking on this kind of endeavor? And maybe that can show to Nova Scotians that they have skin in the game, that they are invested in this, and that Southwest Nova will be serviced and taken care of and supported.
Mr. Fitzner?
Yeah, so I alluded to it a little bit earlier on, but basically the financial risk for the thing is largely borne by the province of Nova Scotia. And just to put that in context, even under a different arrangement similar to the Nova Star arrangement, where there was a negotiated amount of subsidy, as soon as the money was spent, you had two options. You either stopped the service or you paid more money into it. So, you know, I can't think of a contract that, as the deputy said, that you know, a private contractor is going to sign up for a guaranteed losing run. And we've seen for 10 years plus that the run has not been able to make it, but it has value to the province, and so that's why the subsidy goes into it. The operator is largely responsible for the operating risks of the boat. I mentioned the, making sure that the passengers are safely transported back and forth. There's huge numbers of rules that apply to these type of operations. They're responsible to meet all those things. They're subject to, you know, charges and anything if they fail to operate accordingly. They're responsible for the boat itself, and that's under charter, and if something were to happen to that boat, it would be a large financial hit to them, either through their insurance rates going through the roof or something that would spin off into their other businesses as well. Environmental issues, like they'd be responsible for. If there was a spill or anything involved in that, the province wouldn't be responsible for that. So that's, you know, in a nutshell, the difference. But the financial risk is with the province, as it pretty well always has been since the days where it actually made money. But if a ferry was making money, I would suggest the government wouldn't need to be there. There'd be operators vying to do the run, you know.
Mr. Stroink, Mr. Grant wishes to make a comment. Would you like to hear?
Absolutely.
Mr. Grant?
Yeah, so at last week's announcement, we passed out the contract that the province signed with Bay Ferries, and so part of the answer to your question would be in Section 4 of that contract, which outlines in a fair bit of detail, and I won't read them off because I think the contract's been fairly widely made fairly widely available, but it outlines in detail what the responsibilities of Bay Ferries are under this agreement. And so, as my colleague has already pointed out, that yes, while there's financial responsibility on the province for ensuring the services is there are a number of risks to Bay Ferries in terms of operating the ferry service. I think Mr. McDonald, when asked that question last Thursday, said there are always risks in operating a ferry service where you're transporting people over large stretches of open water. And so those would be the risks to Bay Ferries under this particular contract.
Great, thank you. And I guess my follow-up question is, Bay Ferries was the winners of the RFP. They won this contract. They were not selected. So I guess, with that in mind, did the government have a gun to their head on the procurement of the boat? Because there seems to be, for a time lag on the purchase of the boat. But what is intriguing to me is, and you mentioned it, sort of the bureaucratic process through the United States and the Pentagon, to be able to get a boat out of the Pentagon in such a finite, quick turnaround time is pretty impressive. And I think that there would have been a lot of support within the U.S. Senate and in the Pentagon to get this boat to be the ferry. Maybe you can walk us through a bit of that process, because I think it's very key for Nova Scotians to understand that this was hard work and a lot of effort was put into to get this boat from the Pentagon.
Mr. Grant?
Thank you. So just one point of clarification. You referenced an RFP process. The process that we entered into in September was a request for service. And I don't profess in any way to be an expert in procurement, but we did check with our procurement folks. And the document that we released is not typical of a normal request for proposals process, where you would have a very specific criteria outlined, and there would be some legally binding contract that was result from that process. What the request for service basically outlined was there were certain requirements that the province, or certain expectation that the province outlined in its request for service and minimum standards that any operator had to meet. As long as they satisfied those requirements, the process from then on, and I think as already indicated, we started detailed discussions with Bay Ferries somewhere after the 1st of October. Once that decision was made, we essentially sat down and started a back and forth conversation with Bay Ferries about the details of what this service would actually look like. To say that negotiations started on a specific day, I think, there were ongoing discussions. With respect to the vessel, they had proposed, as was already outlined, certain vessels that would meet the criteria for the Yarmouth run. And again, there were lots of conversations back and forth about those particular vessels and what that would mean for this particular service. To give you an example of what I mean by that, the current model that they're using is a high-speed ferry option which leaves Yarmouth in the morning, touches Portland in the afternoon, and comes back to Yarmouth in the evening. There's nothing in the RFS that says you have to leave Yarmouth in the morning and come back in the afternoon. The RFS really said we want a daily service between Yarmouth and Portland. I forget the last part of your comment.
I was just talking about the Pentagon and the procurement process of that. Because there was a lot of support within the U.S. government to ensure that this occurred.
Yeah, so we were aware very early on that Bay Ferries had entered into discussions with the U.S. Navy over the use of a Navy vessel. To say any of us were privy to any discussions that went on in the Pentagon would be a bit of a stretch, although, we might like to think that we were right there. But these were really discussions that Bay Ferries and their representatives, more importantly, were having with the U.S. Navy. We were provided with a contract a few weeks ago that outlined the details of that agreement. But up until that point, all of the conversations between the Navy and Bay Ferries were through their broker and representatives in Maine.
Mr. LaFleche?
I think it's important to point out that on the political side in Maine, we had great support from Senator King and a female congresswoman who's unfortunately, her name I forget right now. But much of this was due to the connections that Bay Ferries had. Well, despite the fact that Bay Ferries is Nova Scotian, and here they have had very good connections in other areas of the world, including New England, and they were able to lever those to get us the right boat. The first time ever, I'm told, that the U.S. government has ever leased a boat to a civilian service outside of the United States. So this was very unique, and a lot of that was due to the work of the various senators and Congress people, and Mayor of Portland and the Secretary of Economic Development there. A lot of that due to the connections that Bay Ferries had. They did show us a number of boats. We have to be cognizant that all of these boats have to meet all the U.S. transportation and all the Canadian transportation requirements, and they have to meet them in a timely fashion. So despite what some people may say, we can't just show up with any old boat. Any old boat may work, but it may take 2 years to get certified and get in there. That's not was the objective. We had a very, very narrow target. The Nova Star didn't work out for us, the Nova Star boat. The Nova Star company didn't seem to have the connections, even though they're from Maine, that Bay Ferries had, surprisingly. In fact, the Nova Star Company, as Ms. Surratt outlined, if I wanted to have a meeting with them, I had to buy the coffee. They had no money, so they were unlimited in terms of their ability to feed off the Nova Scotia government. Bay Ferries is a company who has other assets, has other runs, and other connections, and that was very important in terms of getting the right boat for the right run. And we're very pleased with the timing we have for the runs. As Mr. Grant said, this timing was not in the original RFS. It is a timing that we could only dream about, and we've achieved it so that every night people are in Yarmouth. Mark MacDonald has come and said to us, and I think you've heard this from Pam Mood, that Yarmouth now has to be ready. Southwest Nova has to be ready. Mr. Bellevaux has to get his places ready there in Woods Harbor. Because there are going to be a lot of people coming in to Southwest Nova who are going to want to stay there overnight to either take or arrive and stay overnight on the late ferry, and we have to be ready for that. That's a good news story. That's a story we wanted to have, and that's what we're going to be able to achieve because Bay Ferries was able to get us this boat through connections that they have.
Great. Thank you so much, and I guess that's what's going to drive the Southwest economy. So it just and it's going to help the Southwest economy, Southwest Nova, to succeed. So thank you very much for your question.
Mr. Farrell, you just have about a minute remaining.
A minute. Okay, I'll start and then maybe finish up on our next round. But I wanted to ask about the model and the experience. And it appears that when we got into the Nova Star situation, that we were looking at a particular model that was a longer run and maybe a richer experience. And now we're back to something that's going to make the run in a little bit less time. And I just want to get your thoughts on why we picked the Nova Star model, I'll call it, and why we've now switched back to the high-speed model.
I was going to say Ms. Stevens could perhaps answer that.
I was hoping we could get her involved. She seems only.
Ms. Stevens.
A couple of things. First of all, from a customer experience perspective, if you look at some of the information that Bay Ferries has provided about this vessel, there is in fact quite a few amenities on board. So for a 5.5-hour crossing, I suspect our consumers will be well taken care of. But on the other hand, if you look at sort of overall from a leisure travel perspective, visitors are looking for all kinds of modes of transportation, and if they choose to take the ferry, perhaps being over.
I do apologize. Perhaps you can continue that answer in the next round. We'll move back to the PC caucus. Mr. Houston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for Ms. Surratt. We've heard Deputy talk about maximizing economic benefit. We hear lots of kind of anecdotal discussion about the economic impact of this. Do you have, does the department have an economic impact model that they can share with this committee?
No, we don't.
Okay,
no.
so there's no. Does the department have any range of numbers that they would say we believe this is the economic impact we're getting for the cost? It's a cost-benefit analysis. Has any of that been done to your knowledge?
Ms. Surratt.
Our department has not done that. No.
Okay. Is the deputy aware of any department having done an actual analysis of the economic impact of this on the province?
Yeah, there's been a lot of studies done over the years. And I think
can you share a study with us?
Yeah, the 540 pages of material that we dumped on you has some of that.
Okay, just in the interest of time, what is the economic impact? Can you give me a range of numbers? How many million is the economic impact of the province on restoration of this ferry?
I don't know that anyone can give you that answer.
Okay, so it wasn't. So what we've heard is that it was never a consideration of how much this would cost. There was no line in the sand and nobody can give an answer on what the economic impact might be. But yet we have a 10-year contract. The words of sustainability and stable I find very interesting in the context of this discussion. We have a boat for 4 years and a contract for 10 years. We have no cap on how much it could possibly cost taxpayers. The deputy has referred to a theoretical cap, and I take issue with that because in year 4, Bay Ferries could come with a new boat that could cost $80 million a year. And the department might think that that is egregious, but they have no contractual mechanism to dispute that other than arbitration. It's not even in the department's hands at that point.
That's not true.
Arbitrate. What is the cap then on the most it could spend each year?
Mr. LaFleche.
Well, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah.
Ms. Surratt.
I mean, there's obviously a cap.
So in terms of the charter, after 4 years or 3 years, if Bay Ferries decides not to extend the 4th year, they come with a boat that's not acceptable to the province, and we can terminate.
Under which clause of the contract?
Maybe what section of the contract.
And I believe that termination clause called for the province to pay 3 years worth of fees, which are unknown to this committee.
Up to 3 years, yes. It's 3 years of the management fee, and then it goes. It breaks down.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's really no cap in this contract. Is it the department's position that there is? Is there a cap in this contract on how much this could cost taxpayers over the 10 years?
There's a cap.
Mr. Fitzner.
Sorry. There's a cap to the extent that when we look at the annual budget, if they ever get to a point that it seems like there's not enough value for the money that's going to cost, then there would be a government decision. Do they want to carry on? I
don't see where that is in the contract that the province signed, because if there's not enough value for the money, which I don't think that's been a consideration so far in this discussion, and I heard as much this morning. So there's not enough value, and nobody will say what the economic impact is. That's the value. Like I'm really struggling with that, and if I guess what I want to know very succinctly, is there a cap in the contract as to how much this could cost taxpayers over 10 years? Ms. Surratt?
So there's no cap in the contract.
Okay, that's all I was trying to get to, and there's really.
But if you just let me finish, but there's nothing that we have seen over the last 2 years of experience that we have with Novastar, as well as the experience that Bay Ferries would have, that what has been provided in terms of the numbers is not realistic. We've based the numbers on a 60,000 passenger count.
With all due respect,
and this is a good start.
Order.
Sorry.
Order. Please let Ms. Surratt finish the answer.
But I think it's also important to note that the contract is based on driving the numbers down. So we've based the numbers that we have put out for the next 2 years on a good foundation. However, the contract is based on incenting the provider to drive passenger counts up and bring the expenses down.
Mr. Houston.
All that in the environment of not knowing what the boat might possibly be after year 4. And that's just a little hard for me to take. But I do want to move on in the interest of time. Unless we know what the boat's going to be after year 4. Do we know what the boat's going to be after year 4?
Well, if the Novastar if the CAT works out, we hope it's the CAT, and we know the performance.
It's nice to hope.
We cannot have a boat after year 4 if we're not happy. We can do all sorts of things. We know how much we could possibly lose if we have no passengers. In fact, I think Mr. Bailey has done that calculation.
I don't agree that you know how much you can lose, because you don't know what boat it is.
We know
different boats will cost different.
For the first 2 years and probably 4, it's this boat.
I'm talking about 10 years. You're talking about 2 years. I think that's the disconnect.
Yeah, but we're going to have a boat. If this boat works out, we'll keep the boat. If it doesn't work out, we'll get a better boat. I don't see what the problem is here.
Okay.
Because we can actually have the flexibility to do that.
It's not. You're leasing a boat from the U.S. Navy that could determine that they don't want to lease it to you anymore.
That's
right. Do you control that?
Well, we control it, except in the event of an extreme emergency that they need the boat back, but then we'll get another boat. I don't understand what the issue is here.
Well, then we have a longer discussion to have. You have a 4-year lease on a boat. You have no control over whether that lease is renewed after 4 years. I want to move on and talk about winter work.
Winter work?
And I have
over 4 year. I'm going to Brooklyn.
Order. We'll ask Mr. Houston to ask the question. Mr. LaFleche, please wait, and then Mr. LaFleche, you can answer the question. Mr. Houston.
If this summer run loses $15 million and Bay Ferries secures winter work for this vessel and gets a route where they make $20 million, does any of that $20 million benefit the taxpayers of this province?
Ms. Surratt.
Can you just clarify what you mean when you say loses $15 million?
If the summer run costs the taxpayers of Nova Scotia $15 million, and then Bay Ferries identifies a winter route and takes the vessel somewhere and does a winter route, and has a profitable run, makes $20 million, I don't know. The province, knowing that the taxpayers have paid 15, is there any possible benefit to the taxpayers of this province from that vessel being used on a winter run that's profitable?
So in terms of winter work, if the winter work is agreeable by the province and agreeable by the U.S. Navy, then we would allow winter work and it would go against the subsidy.
Okay.
So we would, if there was a benefit, we would definitely reap in the benefit.
Okay, that's when I read the contract, the ferry service that we're subsidizing is very clearly defined as a seasonal service to be operated between Yarmouth and Portland. That's what we're subsidizing. So is it the position of the department that there's another clause that somehow lets us claw back that subsidy should there be winter work, and if so, can you point that out to me in the contract?
I think there's a clause in here.
Yeah, we'll have
Mr. LaFleche.
We'll have the lawyer figure it out and get back. But yeah, so there would be a negotiation.
Just order. I do apologize, but if a person's mic is not on our record, can't pick up on what's being said. So, Mr. Fitzner, would you wish to answer?
Yeah, I'm just saying that I'll go through this quickly, but I believe the contract stipulates that before they would use it for any other reason than the service for Yarmouth, they would need approval from the province as well as the Navy. And so if they found something that they were proposing to do, we would sit down and negotiate under what circumstances we would allow that. And of course, we wouldn't allow it in any circumstance where the money that the province has put forward for that service was subsidizing some other run somewhere else. That just would be a non-starter.
Well, that's interesting because the as kind as it is for the U.S. Navy to allow the taxpayers of Nova Scotia to fix up their boat for them and get it ready for a route. And lease it for a maximum of 4 years is what they've agreed to. If this vessel has any winter work whatsoever, the taxpayers of this province have subsidized it just by the very nature of spending the upfront cost to get it ready. So I don't want to read too much into the comments, but it seems like the concept of winter work has not been well thought out at this point, because I have a concern that the committee has not been able to alleviate, and that is that the taxpayers are paying for the whole summer run. Every single penny that it costs to operate that summer run, the taxpayers of Nova Scotia are paying. No matter how much it costs, we're paying, and for 10 years. And nobody knows what that is. Nobody is willing to take a stab as to how much that might be, but we're paying. And not only that, we're paying to get the boat ready. So that becomes, if we're paying for the summer route and there is winter work for it, do we get any benefit from that? Or are we just setting the stage with our tax dollars to prepare for that to happen? And if waiting for a lawyer's response is one thing, I heard a comment that of course we would get the benefit from that, but I'm not so sure. I see the deputy wants to chime in. I'd be interested to hear from him on this subject.
Mr. LaFleche.
Yeah, we've taken a stab at helping you out on your calculations. Your own leader did that. And
where did my leader do the calculations?
Well, he was in the paper this morning.
Can you produce that as an exhibit?
He went 10 times 10 equals 100.
Yeah.
So he took a stab. I took a stab. We're fairly confident on what
stab did you take to present? What number?
Well, I told you, if we had no passengers, what our losses would be.
How much?
Well, they would be 13 million more than we've subsidized.
No, tell me over 10 years. He said 100 million.
Well, if we had
What's
the
your
same
number?
boat, all the same conditions, and we actually were crazy enough to run the boat for 10 years with no passengers on it, we would lose 13 million more than we've subsidized times 10 years. But of course, we're not going to do that. Why would we do it? If after 2 weeks there isn't a single passenger, we would probably look at things.
And how much would that cost?
There's provisions in the contract for that. The next thing I want to address is this issue of the winter work. In the Novastar situation, they actually proposed to us that we would subsidize ferry runs for other countries. And in fact, there were people out there that thought we should do that, which was crazy. We were going to lose lots of money subsidizing. So they never found any winter work. It was all hilarious. In fact, we phoned the ports. They were supposed to have these work.
Order. I do apologize. We've run out of time there. We'll move to the NDP caucus and Mr. Bellevaux.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I find this deeply interesting. Mr. Flesch, you talked about in your earlier comments talking about if this boat is not the right boat, and I quote, we can get a better boat. And I'll use that as kind of a backdrop because of, if I could just take you back to 2009, the previous catamaran, the critics of the time described that boat as some serious flaws. Basically, no trucks was allowed, high ticket costs, and the locals actually had a term, and they used this to say, they described the cat of the time, catamaran, they said it was a Cadillac used to pick up a loaf of bread. And to me, it's basically was trying to capture that what they needed for that particular application was a workhorse. And the workhorse I make reference to is the Prince of Acadia, which we retired here a couple of years ago. And using that as the backdrop, the catamaran, and I can get a number of local politicians, provincially, municipally, and federally, said 2009, the CAT was not the right application. So here we are, fast forward 2016, we have a CAT. Can you explain how something can be not suited in 2009 and fast forward we have a smaller version of a catamaran?
Mr. Kristen is going to take that, but first I want to, you started by saying something like I said this was the wrong boat and I didn't quite understand what you said.
No, I had you quoted as saying if we can't find a boat, we can get a better boat.
If we can't find a boat, we can get a better boat?
Yeah, that's what yes, that's what you said.
I have a guarantee of be a better boat. This one or a better one.
If we can't find a boat, we can get a better boat. Is this at the end of the 4 years you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay, so I thought you were talking about I was criticizing the CAT.
No, I was saying that.
Was I criticizing the Nova Star? No. Okay, that's a different subject. Okay, you go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, so
Mr. Fitzner.
Basically, you know, the CAT, when it was in service in Yarmouth, I believe carried 1.2 million customers over 1.7 over 10 years, which are numbers that we would just dream about now. So although some people may complain that it wasn't the right boat, and there was an expert panel that was put together that looked at how, after it was discontinued, how they could resurrect it, and they suggested the cruise ferry model, which is the model that we adopted under the Nova Star, and it didn't seem to be, you know, the model in actuality, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. Years ago, the cruise ferry business was not as, you know, prolific as it is now. You can get reasonably priced cruises anywhere in the world, you know, just about any time you want. So a boat that's really moving from Yarmouth to Portland would have a hard job competing if they're billing themselves as a cruise ferry. Our feeling at transportation was this was more of a significant transportation link, and for that to be working the best and moving the most amount of people, it has to be efficient, it has to be fast. And so, you know, after having the experience of the past 2 years with Nova Star, you know, we went back to look at the high-speed ferry. It cuts the time in half. You know, there's people that would tell us that they may as well drive up around through New Brunswick as get onto the Nova Star. When you were on there for 11 hours, it was quite a long time. So that was some of the reasoning that went into. We feel that in today's world, people want to get somewhere, they want to get there fast. We want to get them to the province as fast as they can and enjoy their time here.
Mr. Bellevaux.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, through you to the delegation, the previous CAT, the criticisms were regarding the high ticket sales. And I noticed in some of the literature, the media comments that My understanding is that the tickets has not been established, the price of them as of today, but maybe by mid-April that they will be established. But I did see a comment saying that they would be similar to the previous CAT of the 2009. Can you elaborate on that particular question?
Mr. Fitzner.
Yes, our understanding, we had some discussions with the Bay Ferries on what their fare structure would look like, and what they told us, it'll probably be slightly less than the pricing on the Nova Star, and it's hard to compare it exactly because there was a lot of discounted prices and different things that would happen during the year. But it wouldn't include the overnight cabin now that it just runs through the day. So, you know, a family that was traveling there in a car would probably see, you know, a reduction in the overall fare rate.
Mr. Chair, again, continuing on that same theme, 2009, fast forward to where we are today, fuel costs have adjusted, and in fact, they are in favor of the consumer. I suggest that the catamaran is an energy hog, and she loves the fuel. So, is that going to be reflected in establishing the fares of 2016 season?
So, for the budget for the current year, I think fuel prices are currently around, their oils are about $40 a barrel right now, and we have actually built in a bit of a, you know, a cushion there in case they go up, but our understanding is probably through, and I mean, who knows where fuel prices will go, but just in looking what the experts predict, that, you know, maybe by 2020 oil is back up to $60 a barrel. So I think we're pretty comfortable for at least the first 2 years that the fuel will be less than, you know, the amount that we've budgeted for.
Okay, Mr. Chair, again, there's a number of interesting questions that comes out, and I'm sure that the opposition media will have. Is there going to be a mechanism in place that the media or opposition parties can look at the books on a semi-annual basis, on an annual basis, to evaluate and see if actually what's taking place with Bay Ferries?
Mr. Fitzner?
So as part of the agreement, it requires that they provide audited statements at the end of each season to us. I'm just not, I don't know the answer to the second part, is whether those statements could be made publicly available. And again, we would have to refer to our FOIPOP person to determine if that was the case.
Ms. Surratt and then Mr. LaFleche.
Yeah, so as part of the contract, we also have a true-up. So what we, in terms of the subsidy that we, like the 10-2, if it came in at 9, we would pay 9. So there's quarterly true-up process. Now, in terms of disclosing that information, we would have to, you know, yeah, we'd have to talk to the FOIPOP officer, just because it would be confidential information related to a private company.
Mr. LaFleche?
Yeah, I wanted to emphasize that point. In the media availability we had last week, one of the reporters was very hung up on the issue of how much were we paying Mr. McDonald in terms of his salary. Nova Star had only one entity this run. It was basically almost a subsidiary of the government. It had no other functionality in life. Bay Ferries has a lot of other things they do in life. So the records that we will give you will be related to the Yarmouth Ferry run, not related to Bay Ferries operations worldwide. We have no great knowledge of Mr. McDonald's salary or any other salary or anything he does with respect to maybe the Digby ferry line or any other ferries that he runs anywhere else. So it's this is a large company that has a lot of other operations. The information we will have will be related to the Yarmouth to Portland run.
Well, speaking about salaries and being paid, the previous ferry system, Nova Star, there was some outstanding bills left for vendors, and I made reference to this. A lot of people find some humor in it. Actually, the piper never got paid, and I think the piper needs to get paid. And I'll leave that with you if you have some information on whether that's been corrected in the last 5 or 6 months. But my question is basically this is a very generous contract or deal. So if Bay Ferries can go out and they want to get musicians in or sports celebrities or whatever, circuses or whatever, and I'm making an extreme point here, to attract people for their ferry system. What's stopping them from doing any of the above, and what's protecting the local bagpiper from the piper getting actually paid?
Well, as I stated previously, we're dealing with a very different entity here. First of all, it's a company in Canada. It's got other assets which can be seized or attacked if the company doesn't pay the circus performers, etc. That is not the case with Novastar. It was a U.S. company. It essentially disappeared when the bankruptcy occurred. There's no, we have to respect those proceedings. We have no further relationship with us. We don't owe them money. They don't owe us money. And that's all we can really do. And the U.S. courts will now deal with these situations. In the case of Bay Ferries, it'll be done in Canada. You have a company with many other assets, significant assets. So if the circus performer doesn't get paid and it's found to be a legitimate case, he will have access through the bankruptcy procedures in the courts in Canada, which is a much better situation.
Mr. Chair, I know my time is limited. I will get down to the short snappers here, but I wanted to be interested during this whole contract discussions. Were there any discussions with American officials about potential participating in subsidies on behalf of the United States government?
You want to take that or me? Okay, go.
Mr. Grant, you just have about 10 seconds.
Yes.
Here we go. Order. Time has expired. We'll move to the Liberal caucus and Mr. Farrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you want to finish something up there, Mr. Grant? I give you the opportunity on our time.
Well, so we've had, since last summer, we've had a number of discussions both at the state level and with the City of Portland in terms of how they can, I'll say, participate in the financing of the Yarmouth Ferry run. It's very difficult under their system to participate the same way that we might in Canada do, but I think as recently as last week we reached out again to officials in the U.S. and we'll continue those conversations about how they may be able to partner with us either on infrastructure improvements that need to be made there or any way that they can contribute to the success of the Yarmouth-Portland ferry service. We would be interested in having those discussions. Nothing specific to report on at this particular time, though.
Great. Now I want to quickly go back to Ms. Stevens to allow her to finish the answer, and I'll very briefly restate my question. What led to the Novastar cruise model being chosen in the first place? What were the problems with it? And why do we think that the high-speed CAT model is going to work better for us now?
That's great.
Ms. Stevens?
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me just to finish that train of thought. So I think Bruce actually answered a couple of those areas. I think the two things that we have to keep in mind is that consumers all have different needs, and when they're looking at for leisure travel and their modes of transport, they're looking for various different experiences. So I think the CAT in itself, the fact that it is a shorter transportation, a 5.5 hour crossing, I think will be a significant benefit. The other fact that Bruce did mention, and which is what we're certainly looking forward to from a tourism perspective, is the fact that we'll have more visitors in the province longer, and they're getting here quicker. So the opportunity for the arrival early in the evening into the South Shore is excellent, and that's going to definitely benefit the southern part of the province. But more importantly, being able to arrive the evening before to be there for the departure is yet a second opportunity. So this opportunity is almost, from our perspective, a double boost when we look at it from the experiences that the travelers can participate in and the accommodations that it's going to drive. So overall, I think there's pros and cons to both experiences, but at 5.5 hours, I think the fact that we're getting our visitors quicker and we have them here longer will ultimately be the key driver.
So do you know what the amenities will be on the new boat, and if Nova Scotians will have the opportunity to provide those things like we'll say entertainment, because I know that's what Mr. Belliveau is referring to when he uses the expression "pay the piper." There were quite a number of people in Southwest who were quite happy with the volume of work that they received from the Nova Star deal in terms of providing entertainment and those types of things on the boat.
Yeah. So I can speak to a little bit of my previous experience working with Bay Ferries in some of their other operations. So that is very much part of their overall marketing plan, is to work as closely as possible with local artisan providers on board their ship. But as part of not only on board their ship, but also visitor servicing and providing lots of information. So while they've got a captive audience for those visitors, to make sure that there's those trip planning tools available as well. So our experience with Bay Ferries in terms of some of their other ferry routes that's been a very strong area for them. In addition, they have their packaging area where they're booking in with experienced providers or hotel operators. So those are yet another opportunity to, when you've got a captive visitor for 5.5 hours, to share that information.
Thank you. I'll pass on to my colleague, Ms. Lonis-Croft.
Ms. Lonis-Croft.
Thank you. And the ferry does reach as far as Lunenburg, and we are happy that the ferry is back. Thursday, the announcement came on March 24th, and may I have permission to read part of an email that I received from a constituent? It's 6:15 Thursday night, and I just saw that the new ferry service has been confirmed with Bay Ferries. It really buzzword me off that the minister would sign a contract that would supply U.S. crews. So with that question to me by a constituent, I'd like to ask, can you tell me the employment situation with the new ferry?
Ms. Surratt?
So I'll take a stab at that. So the U.S. crew, so it's obviously a U.S. military vessel, so it's a U.S. flagship. So the crew has to be U.S. citizens. I do know that there will be some other forms of employment on the boat that would be Canadian. We know that because the boat is going to be docked or port in Yarmouth, that the cleaning and the actual stocking of the boat and all that will be done in Yarmouth. We know that Bay Ferries has also, in terms of accommodations, there are, I think they rented 5 homes or something like that for the accommodations for the crew, and we know that supplies and all of that would be done in Nova Scotia.
So unlike the previous ferry, there will be employment to Canadians? You're affirming?
Mr. LaFleche?
The answer is yes, but if I step back for a minute and look at what we've done here, we had a U.S. management corporation. The president, the vice president, the other vice president, the director of marketing, they were all U.S. citizens. They were all living in Maine, and all of the salaries, the large salaries, and I know there was an article recently saying that, Nova Scotia only got the bad jobs. In fact, the Americans are getting those jobs like cleaning the dishes and stuff on the boat. We're getting the president, vice president, all those big jobs at Bay Ferries. So in fact, we've taken a situation where the Americans got all the high-paying jobs to one where the Canadians will get all the high-paying jobs. So that's one distinct benefit that we have. Also, I saw an article where someone was quoted as saying the vessel will not be serviced by Canadians. That is wrong. It will be serviced overnight in Yarmouth by Canadians. That's another benefit of what Ms. Stevens described. So that's A second huge benefit is that it gets serviced here in Canada, except for the original outfitting, which is by a prior arrangement that Mr. McDonald has. But the daily servicing of it, the provisioning of it, and all the management will be Canadians. Big advantage. The only thing we're not getting is the crew, which do most of the low-value jobs, the opposite of the newspaper article that I saw. Not blaming the media, someone quoted that to them. So we're not getting those jobs. The Americans are getting those jobs. So if I had a preference as to our partners in New England get those jobs because of the flag concern, or a country in the Far East get those jobs, as it was in the case of Novastar, I would much prefer our partners, the Americans, get those jobs, because then they're getting a benefit which, you know, makes them a lot more interested in this service than they would be. I did not see any subsidies or any partnership or anything good coming from Indonesia, Malaysia, or the Philippines due to the Novastar deal. I believe we've already seen a significant benefit from the United States of America and from New England and the state of Maine. So I'm happy, if we can't get the jobs because of the flag issue, to have Americans get those jobs, because that further cements or solidifies the historic relationship that Southwest Nova has with New England.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Goff, did you have any questions?
Yeah, I just had one. I was just wondering, has the state of Maine contributed financially to this ferry service? And if not, why?
Mr. Grant?
Yeah, well, I tried to answer that in a previous question, but the state of Maine has not contributed the same way that the province of Nova Scotia has contributed financially, but the state of Maine has made a substantial investment in upgrading the terminal facilities in Portland. I don't know if you've been there, but anybody that was there when the service was operating previously and's returned would notice a big difference in terms of the port facilities there, the terminal facilities in Maine. That was all financed by the state of Maine. A substantial investment. I can't remember the exact number, but it was in excess of $20 million. They've also improved the marshalling area where you come off the boat or where you're waiting to get on the boat. All of those improvements were made. Again, you know, I think there was probably $4 or $5 million of contribution put in there. Whenever we have the discussion with Maine about contributing to the ferry service, both the state and the city have difficulty with the concept of contributing to subsidizing the operations of the ferry. In their political system, that creates problems for them. And again, I don't know what the legislative restrictions are, but they're limited to how they can participate. They have, though, and I'll go back to the deputy's earlier comment, officials in the state of Maine were both at the Senate level and in Congress and with the city of Portland were instrumental in brokering the deal with the Navy. In fact, I received a letter from a former retired Navy officer who said, you know, the whole thing was ridiculous. It would take 2 years for this thing to be negotiated. We received that letter about 3 weeks ago. And so we have the deal that we have today, and it's unprecedented. I think Maine deserves a lot of credit for making that happen. It's a very unique deal in that we only pay for the vessel for the time that we're using it. Diane has outlined the implications for that from a charter point of view. So Maine has been an active partner throughout this process, and that's had direct financial benefits to the project.
Order. The time has expired. However, Mr. LaFleche, you do have an opportunity for closing comments. We just have about 2.5 minutes left, so perhaps you could keep it to 2 minutes, and if the committee is willing, we could extend beyond 11 a.m. for some committee business that we have afterwards. Do we have agreement on that? We have agreement. So, Mr. LaFleche, if you could sum up in 2 minutes some closing comments.
Yes, I would like to say that I think it's important that everyone who's had questions reads the contract, and if they need help in some of the legal interpretation, we can provide that type of help. What we've tried to do here is get the best deal for Nova Scotians. The best deal is not maybe dependent on the subsidy level totally. It might be dependent on the economic activity. We do view this, though, as a transportation mechanism, like other transportation mechanisms, so the amount of due diligence on economic benefits would be of the nature of those other transportation systems. I do appreciate that at one time, under a previous government, they were trying to justify this as an economic development only operation. That is not where we are today. This is also a vital transportation, cultural, social link between Southwest Nova and New England, so we are justifying it on more than just one ground, and the evaluations that we do when we look at renewing this service or continuing it at the various stages that are outlined in the agreement will be looked at in that sort of vein. I want to thank my colleagues here. They've worked very hard, as I know the previous crew of Simon D'Entremont and David Oxner did, to negotiate agreements. This is a very difficult situation because this ferry was stopped. We've got to restart it. We've got to start from zero. There are a number of challenges, and I know Mr. Beliveau has mentioned some of them, that people would like us to look at. Today is not the day at the early start to look at them. We've got to get off to a good start. We have to have the citizens of Southwest Nova ready, the businesses ready to receive these ferry passengers and to make this a success. We will be looking at building upon that as we have success. But to start off and make some of the same mistakes we did in the previous attempt would not be wise. So we're starting conservative, we're starting small, and we hope to build. We believe this is a good agreement. We've negotiated a lot of agreements. I've mentioned the Nova Centre recently. My department negotiates agreements every day. We have a very sophisticated group of negotiators in the background on the legal side. We feel we know what we're doing, and we knew what we were doing when Mr. Houston's team was in government. We knew what we were doing when Mr. Belliveau's team was in government, and we feel we currently know what we're doing. We are the people who actually sit down, these types of people, and negotiate the agreements. And we're a bit dismayed when we read in the media that we're very poor negotiators and we've been hosed. Would like to not have those comments out there, but I do want to admit that we do have issues with spelling, okay? So, and I'm going to blame this on the guy that the arrow's pointing to. So that may cause you to lose a slight amount of confidence in us, and in fact that's why my kids rang me out this morning. Daddy, you can't even spell Newfoundland. How are you going to help us?
For Newland found.
Anyway, despite these small issues and Petit Jacquard Road down in your area, etc., we're generally very good at what we do. So we'd appreciate that that's respected out there. Thank you to the committee and all of you. There's been some rough questions today. We take that in stride, not personal. The members have to do their job. They do a good job at it, and we appreciate that. And I think the questions, the tough questions that have been asked by some of you, including some of the Liberals actually, those tough questions are good for the public and the media to hear and allow us to get the answers out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Flesh, and thank you to all of our witnesses who have been with us today. Appreciate you being here and answering all of our questions. You are free to leave. We have just a couple of minutes of committee business. If you look, we have correspondence from Department of Finance and Treasury Board that was requested from our February 24th meeting. Are there any questions on that? We had correspondence from the Department of Department of Business from the March 2nd meeting. This was an item that we talked about briefly this morning in camera. I'm not going to talk about what we discussed there, but that information is from Department of Internal Services. Oh, I'm sorry, I've mixed. Okay. Thank you to our clerk for setting me straight. I'll raise that one at the end. We had correspondence from the Department of Business on visitor information centers. That was in response to a request from a March 2nd meeting. Are there any comments or questions on that? Hearing none. Okay. The next item is the annual conference that's typically attended by myself, the Vice Chair, and a representative of the NDP caucus. This year it's in the Northwest Territories from August 21st to 23rd. There's no rush on this, but I find with these sorts of things it's probably best for people to think about it now and perhaps respond soon. They are asking us for topics that we could discuss at the conference. You may have some ideas around that. You're welcome to suggest them at any time during our meetings or by email to myself or the clerk. We can't promise you that a topic will be discussed because it is up to the CCPAC to decide what kind of an agenda they're putting on. But it is an opportunity if people wish for us to look at certain aspects of how our committee operates. And I would certainly be glad, I'm sure the Vice Chair will be glad to bring you a report back from that conference when we return from it. And certainly if one of the topics that you've proposed is discussed, we'll bring you a full report on that. So does anyone have any topics they'd like to bring forward today? Okay. So I'm going to leave that with you. And I don't think we will bring it up again. So I recommend that you have a look at that in the next couple of days. And if you wish to propose a topic, we're all ears. Our next meeting. Oh, there is this other piece of correspondence, and we passed over it in our last meeting. And this is from the Department of Internal Services. This is one that we discussed this morning about leased office space. Is there any interest on the part of the committee to further pursue an answer to the question about the amount of unused office space currently being leased by the province? Mr. Houston?
Absolutely, there is. I think the committee should write back to the Department of Internal Services. And Department of Internal Services were very pleased to advise that the province does not lease any unused office space. That's what they advised this committee, and they qualified that a little bit with that they don't have the ability to determine whether a portion of space within a particular lease is unused. That kind of negates the whole first statement that they're not leasing any unused office space. But I think I would go back. I would hope that the committee would go back with a very specific question about the space in Pictou County that came out in the media just a couple weeks after this committee was advised that they're not leasing any unused office space. There's a media report in Pictou County that they are leasing a land registry office. It's a couple $100,000 a year. Actually, it's $124,000 a year. It looks like from the media. But I would just ask. I would ask that this committee write back and say how can they reconcile those two things? Is it true that the province is leasing this unused office space, and how was that missed by the deputy in their correspondence to the committee?
Thank you. Just in response to that, our clerk has provided a copy of the Hansard for that day. And Mr. Conrad, who was with us as a witness, had responded by saying we're able to see by lease, but not by within a lease. Our database, for example, will show us a lease has been vacated for one reason or another. We can see the end date of the lease, who the occupant is, and all that. We can't go in and say within the lease that every single cubicle within that space is fully occupied on a given day. That's not within our ability. And he goes on to say, I don't have information with me related to the unused space that the province is currently leasing. It's pretty small. It seems to me that I saw a report a number of months ago. I think at that point we had perhaps one or two things like visitor information centers that weren't currently being used, but it's relatively small. I can have that provided by Transportation Infrastructure Renewal if the committee would like. So there has been an offer by the deputy to provide some additional information, but when we did follow up with our letter, we of course got the response we did, which is that you know, I'm pleased to report there. I'll just read it here. I'm pleased to advise that currently the province does not lease any unused space. As noted during my appearance, we do not have the ability to determine whether a portion of space within a particular lease is unused. To Mr. Houston's point. Mr. Rankin.
Maybe we can just ask for clarification and ask for any details, because he alludes to specific data that he looked at, and he did say there is small space not being used, so maybe he can provide the committee with any data that is tracked within the system that's available to the committee.
Okay. Is there agreement on that approach? All those in favor? Okay. We will have our clerk draft a letter and we will pursue that information. We'll report back when we receive it. Our next meeting is on April the 6th with Department of Natural Resources, and that's to discuss Chapter 6 of the Auditor General's report on forest management and protection. We have a briefing with the Auditor General immediately following this meeting. Also on April 6th, we have a briefing after that meeting with the Auditor General on Chapter 3, which is business continuity management. So with that, seeing nothing further to discuss, unless members have anything they wish to discuss, and seeing nothing, we will take a very short recess and return with the Auditor General. It's about 11:10, so if people can stay close by, that would be appreciated. Thank you.